Even more fascinating to get your response to Gad Saad, who joins me now. He's visiting professor, global ambassador at Northwood University. Gad, great to have you back on Uncensored.
Thank you.
And you and I have been having a little very friendly ding-dong on X the last few days. I want to start just by what Mehdi Hassan told me about Islamophobia, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you're kind of the view it doesn't really exist, and that you shouldn't be silenced from criticising Islam by people shouting you're Islamophobic. Now, Mehdi Hassan, and I subscribe to this as well, I think if you launch the kind of ferocious, relentless attacks that someone like Tommy Robinson has done on Islam and Muslims in the way that he's done so many times, it's eventually pretty painfully obvious to people that you're coming at this from a bigoted position. And therefore, by the dictionary definition of Islamophobia, if it comes from a place of hate, that actually is Islamophobia, isn't it?
Thank you so much for having me back, Piers. The devil is in the details, right? So if I were to say that Jews are inherently diseased, they are degenerates, they are evil, they're parasites, that would be anti-Semitic. If I say there are teachings in the Torah that are abhorrent given today's moral codes, that wouldn't be anti-Semitic. So if you were to make dispositional statements about individual Muslims, that would be Muslim bigotry. But if you say anything you want about the codified content of Islam, then by definition, that cannot be Islamophobic.
Okay, so let me play you a little mashup of examples, I would say, where Tommy Robinson has displayed Islamophobia by the criteria in the dictionary. Let's take a look.
We will unify every community against the hostility and barbarianism of Islam. I'm not racist. I despise racism. Islam is not a race. Islam is a fascist, violent ideology which masquerades as a religion.
Every single Muslim watching this video on YouTube, on 7/7, you got away with killing and maiming British citizens.
But we embrace migrants that come to this country and love it. The problem is Islamic migrants come to this country and declare war on it.
Now, when you hear all that, and in particular, it felt to me that what he said about 7/7, which was a bunch of extremist terrorists who happened to be Muslim committing terrorism, when you basically, at a crowd with a loud hailer in your mouth, embrace every single Muslim in the country and say you're all to blame for killing and maiming Brits, that is Islamophobic, isn't it? I mean, it has to be. Otherwise,
so
what is?
Let me address this in using two examples. The number one predictor of child abuse is if there is a step-parent in the house. It is 100 times greater predictor than all other predictors. And yet, most step-parents are perfectly lovely and kind and don't commit abuse. So understanding statistical reasoning and causal inferencing is important. So let me give a second example. Since 9/11 alone, there have been 46,000 plus terror attacks committed in roughly 70 countries by Islamic terrorists. That is an absolute fact, notwithstanding the fact that out of 2 billion Muslims, most did not commit terrorist acts. So we can point to 7/7 and say that that was driven by Islamic ideology, while also speaking from the other side of our mouths that most Muslims that we'll ever meet are peaceful. Both of those two statements are true.
But what the peaceful Muslims would say is that actually it's the twisting of the Islam ideology by extremists that is the problem. It's not a genuine interpretation of Islam, because the vast majority of Muslims are peaceful. So they say,
that's
look,
not true.
Well, is it not true?
No, it isn't.
If that wasn't true,
so
then if that wasn't true, then wouldn't de facto most Muslims commit acts of terrorism?
Most Jews eat prosciutto and also eat shrimps, but they're not practicing a more gentle form of kosher law. They simply ignore the fact that kosher laws dictate that you don't eat shrimps and that you don't eat prosciutto, right? I eat prosciutto. I'm Jewish. I'm not practicing a more peaceful version of Judaism. I just ignore that which I don't wish to apply. Most Muslims don't commit those acts because they are kind and decent people who choose to ignore whichever they don't wish to follow in their texts. But does Islam contain endless quotes, endless edicts that are profoundly problematic to the kuffar? The answer is a resounding yes.
Does the Bible do that?
Yeah, of course the Bible does that,
right?
But
so the same
as
thing.
far
So
as
you're saying you would have the same view of Christianity, for example, would you?
right. Well, if Christians were going around right now quoting passages from the New Testament and committing 46,000 plus terror attacks in nearly 70 countries since 9/11 alone, then I would say we need to worry about those texts. If they were Talmudic extremists doing that, then we would worry about that. Look, Deuteronomy has a lot of nasty things. Find the Elamites and kill them. But I don't know many guys called Mordechai Rubenstein looking for Amalekites to kill them. So, common sense matters, right? Most Muslims are lovely. I know more Muslims than most people will ever meet in their lives. None of them have ever been terrorists. This doesn't take away from the fact that there is an astounding problem with Islamic terrorism. Both those statements are true.
It is, but I would say that, to give you two parallels, very different things. One, as somebody put to me on X today, during the years when the IRA were committing appalling acts of terrorism, it would be like saying, well, then all, according to Tommy Robinson, his logic would say all Irish people are to blame for the maiming and killing, right? Which clearly would have been an outrageous thing to say. Secondly, and I raised this with someone the other day on the show who was incensed that I would even draw this parallel, but I said, why not? If you look at the number of mass shootings in America in the last 30 years, they're almost exclusively perpetrated by deranged young white men. So does that mean that we should, by the same logic, say, well, there's all these terrible mass shootings going on. They're all being committed by the same type of profile of person. Therefore, all young white men in America have to be treated with deep suspicion, which is what Tommy Robinson that's where his logic takes you. That's why I have a problem with the Tommy Robinsons of this world. It's not his message and banging the drum about the rape gang scandal. He's been absolutely right about that. It's just he's such a flawed messenger for all sorts of other reasons. And the reason that's problematic is because he gets used by people who are trying to avoid accountability, because they say, well, look at this guy, the one who's shouting loudest about us. Look at him. He's a convicted football thug. He beats up policemen and gets convicted for it. He's a mortgage fraudster. He's a passport faker. He's committed contempt of court 3 times. He's nearly wrecked trials involving the rape gang scandals. He's made a Syrian refugee boy's life utter hell with his lies. That's why he's now in prison, and so on. In other words, by demonizing the messenger, those who should be held to account are able to hide behind Tommy Robinson being the flag bearer for all this. I think that is a problem.
Look, Tommy Robinson has some issues in his past. I don't know all of them, although I've had a chance to have long conversations with him. He's even come to visit me in Montreal. He never, in my presence, said anything that struck me as bigoted or racist. So I'm not here to defend Tommy Robinson. Christopher Hitchens, whom I'm sure you know well, he's a compatriot British. Excuse me?
I employed him when I was editor of the Daily Mirror. And you know when I employed him? I know what you're about to say to me about what he said about Islamophobia. Before you say it, and you're right to say it, I would point out I hired him during the Iraq War because he supported that war, and the paper opposed it before, during, and after. And I thought it was important to have a voice in the paper up against John Pilger, actually, quite often, who was obviously viscerally against the war. But I let Hitchens run riot. Even though I thought he was completely wrong, and even though I look back on it now and I'm convinced he was completely wrong. So Hitchens wasn't always right, before you say to me what he said about Islamophobia, which you're about to do.
Well, I mean, yes, I can make the point about what he said about Islamophobia, but the point that I was going to make is that Christopher Hitchens is, and I think you'll probably agree with this, one of the most eloquent speakers that we will have ever seen, right? He has a beautiful British accent. He speaks with a beautiful vocabulary, as does Douglas Murray. So they may say things that are, in terms of their content, absolutely indistinguishable from anything that Tommy Robinson says. But Tommy Robinson's style, his accent, is one that serves as an aesthetic injury to the people who carry the progressive lisp. And therefore, people react to Tommy Robinson because of his style of delivery. Elon Musk, who's, as you know, is a good friend of mine, has a direct way of speaking that is not as eloquent as Christopher Hitchens. That doesn't in any way imply that what he is saying is not veridical. So we have to differentiate between the substance and the content.
I don't disagree.
Tommy Robinson.
I've always said that actually about Donald Trump. Same thing, that the rhetoric often bears little relation to what he actually does. I also think it's important to focus on what people actually do. My problem with Elon, who I think is a complete genius, my problem over this week has been the way he's targeted Jess Phillips, a female MP, in my view, wrongly and inaccurately, but that's neither here nor there. By calling her a genocidal rape apologist, he's put a massive target on her head where people have now been arrested for threatening her life. And we've had 2 members of parliament, including a young woman, who've been murdered in the last 10 years in this country. I just think that kind of language crosses a line. I mean, would you agree?
Look, I hear you. I get that. I've been accused of being the orchestrator of the killing of Gazan children. I sit as a professor who's 60 years old in Montreal doing evolutionary psychology research. I have nothing to do with the killing of anyone in Gaza, yet I am the baby genocidal killer. So, of course, I empathize with the point that you're making. And that's why I said that sometimes Elon might be very blunt in the way he says what he says, but the content of what he's saying, the ire that he has, really is coming from a good place, right? Britain does suffer from an orgiastic form of suicidal empathy, the topic of my forthcoming book, because they're much more desirous of protecting the sensibilities of their Muslim population than to worry about the integrity of the bodily and the integrity of children. That's not a good calculus to have. I think that's what triggered the ire of Elon. The fact that he went after this person is regrettable. I share your concern there. But again, I think the fact that you and I and others are having these important conversations, only good things can come from
No,
that.
I completely agree. And actually having Mehdi first, you now, having Matthew here who has his views about it. I mean, it's interesting what you just said. It's not a million miles away from what Matthew said about the woke ideology getting a grip of our country in a way that so many people in officialdom felt incapable or too terrified to do the right thing because they were fearful of retribution and being accused of, being anti-Muslim or whatever it may be. And I completely get that. That's why, I was interested in what you were saying to me, and you said it on the Will Kane show. I love Will. I listened to that interview. It just slightly misinterpreted me. I'm not saying that any criticism of Muslims or Islam is wrong or unacceptable by any means. I think every group of people, whoever they are, I'm a Catholic. The Catholic Church sex scandal, abuse scandal was utterly horrific. It's just one of the most unspeakable things imaginable, that people purporting to be priests were out there abusing children for decades. And it is still going on, I'm sure. And I, as a Catholic, feel totally ashamed about the total lack of accountability, the cover-ups that went on, and the abuse. So I feel exactly the same way about my own church as I do about what's happened here with these British Pakistani Muslims towards, predominantly British Pakistani Muslims, towards young girls. But this I think you and I talked about this before, Gad. The woke ideology was definitely a contributing factor here. People did not want to put their head over the parapet because they were terrified of getting shot.
Exactly right. Look, cultural relativism is a pathogenic idea that I discuss in the parasitic mind, because it purports that who are we to judge the cultural practices, the religious practices of another culture? So if another culture wants to cut off the clitorises of 5-year-old girls, who are you to judge, you cultural imperialist? No, I am here to judge. There are absolutist, deontological, moral principles that any decent person should abide by. Cutting off the clitorises of little girls is never okay. And so you're exactly right that the coupling of these parasitic woke ideas with the reflex of suicidal empathy, put them together, you end up with a cocktail that leads us to the abyss of infinite lunacy.
Do you feel, notwithstanding that, the way that I feel, which is I do think the Trump victory and the scale of it and Elon Musk's contributing factor to that, which was, I think, enormous. By going all in with Trump, I think he had a very persuasive effect, particularly on young men. But do you feel, as I do, that the woke worm is really turning hard, that people are sick of it? They're sick of what they see as a modern form of fascism. They are sick of what they see as Musk calls it, the woke mind virus. And that the ad we were talking about earlier of Kamala's for they, them, Trump's for you, this whole personal pronoun bullshit, the gender ideology bullshit, which was manifested so spectacularly badly with the trans women in women's sport, destroying the integrity of women's sport, and so on, that it's all on the retreat. And the reason I think we could say that with some authority now is the incredible statement from Mark Zuckerberg, which is 6 minutes long and is one of the most extraordinary U-turns I can ever remember a serious public figure like him coming out with, where he basically has just thrown the towel in on this stuff, even down to saying that Facebook fact checkers were the problem because they were coming at the fact checking from a sort of woke ideology point of view, which is not fact checking, and so on. But also saying from now on, you will be allowed to have what have been deemed unacceptable views about gender, about all these issues. And I would say, hurrah! It doesn't give you an excuse to be a vicious bigot, but it should give you the excuse, in fact, the right and the freedom to express yourself about these issues.
Yeah, so I do think that, of course, thank God that Trump won. He will serve as a doorstop against the woke insanity. But I keep trying to remind people not to be complacent in the following sense, Piers. It took about 50 to 100 years for many of these parasitic ideas to develop into the big woke monster that we eventually saw, right? So some of these ideas were spawned on university campuses close to 100 years ago. For example, cultural relativism. Postmodernism developed on university campuses, about 50, 60 years ago. So these ideas have not been completely extinguished. Yes, Donald Trump coming in, he'll be able to clean house very quickly, but the battle will be much longer. So we can't be complacent. Hopefully it won't take 50 to 100 years to eradicate all those bad ideas, but it doesn't start and end with Trump. It's a good first step, but let's keep fighting for truth.
Yeah. Gadsek, great to have you back on Uncensored. Let's not leave you so long next time. It's been very civilized. Very civilized. A template in civilized, reasonable debate. Great to see you.
Thank you. You too. Cheers.
Matthew, what did you make of that?
Well, I agreed with most of it.
Yes.